listening to the Ag Policy Connection, brought to you by RealAgriculture in partnership with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. We're connecting the dots between the people and the policies that shape agriculture and farming today and into the future.
Yes, welcome once again to the Ag Policy Connection podcast here on Real Agriculture. I'm your host, Kelvin Hepner. This is our sixth and final episode of what we're calling Season 3 of the Ag Policy Connection, exploring the future of farmland across Canada, land use policy, what's driving decisions and policies that determine how land gets used, whether it's for conservation purposes, whether it's for farming, for ranching, for food production, or whether it gets developed for urbanization and housing and so on. Of course, land is often an emotional topic. Most of us have strong opinions on how land should get used, how it should get valued, whether you're talking to a farmer or rancher who sees its value in not only in food production, but also in the biodiversity that the different species that may live on their land, whether you're talking to a hunter, a fisherman, an environmentalist, somebody who enjoys going for hikes during the long weekends in summer or camping in summer, somebody who enjoys skiing the back trails, somebody who lives in the concrete jungle of the GTA or downtown Vancouver. Everybody has opinions on how land should get used, and sometimes we bring our own biases and perspectives into that. And so it's been good to share many different and discuss the many different angles influencing how land gets used in Canada, whether it's the economics, whether it's the decision, the balancing act of housing versus farmland, that confrontation that we see across the continent and around the world with the continuous loss of farmland, what it takes to slow that decrease in land area dedicated to food production down. We've explored a lot of these different topics as part of the first 5 episodes, and I encourage you, if you haven't listened to the first 5 episodes of this season, it's part of CAPI's plan initiative, Policies for Land Use, Agriculture, and Nature, trying to drive some more discussion about and bring some attention to these very important topics. I encourage you to look up the Ag Policy Connection podcast in Spotify, on YouTube, Apple Music, wherever you listen to podcasts or watch podcasts. Of course, we're doing it on video this season as well. So check it out at realagriculture.com if you don't listen to it in a podcast app, of course. Thanks again to CAPI for partnering with us to make this podcast possible. And, of course, going back to Season 1, the aim of the Ag Policy Connection podcast is to connect dots and drive discussion, bring together different perspectives shaping ag policy in the past and into the future across Canada, as we aim to bring those different perspectives together to improve what we have for policy driving and shaping farming and food production across the country. And so on this episode, our 6th and final episode, as I already mentioned, for this series, we are going to hear from CAPI's doctoral fellows. So we're calling this episode The Next Generation. Each year, CAPI awards several fellowships to PhD students at universities across Canada as they study specific topics related to policies that CAPI is working on. This year, there are 4 doctoral candidates who are focusing specifically on land use challenges as they relate to farming, biodiversity, and the different topics that we've been talking about on this season. And at the end of their work, they are going to be delivering a research report. So we're going to hear from 3 of these 4 doctoral candidates as part of this episode. First up, we have Ehsan Pashanejad. Ehsan is based on the west coast of Canada, at the University of British Columbia. He is using a spatial system framework, so maps, to study the balance between agricultural productivity and conservation, the relationship between the two across the Canadian prairies, and how work can be done to enhance the ecological resilience of farmland while balancing that with the economic output of the prairies. Kwaku Twum is doing some similar work, as he's going to explain or describe here in just a moment, at the University of Waterloo in Ontario. Kwaku is assessing the impact of digital technologies on farmers' abilities to address climate change challenges, biodiversity loss, and so he's kind of combining the tech aspects. AI is part of this discussion as well, combining that with policy research to understand changes in how land is used and the environmental outcomes from how land gets used. Rounding out our panel for this episode, we have Deslaine Sossou. Deslaine is based at Laval University in Quebec, and I very much appreciate her efforts on this episode, as English is not her first language. So her work is focusing on the economic impacts of soil conservation practices as they get adopted in Quebec. The goal of this research is to identify the most effective region-specific conservation practices that improve not only environmental outcomes but also economic outcomes. Of course, that's an important part of overall sustainability, is that both the environmental and economic must be sustainable in the long term. Finally, I should note Andu Burha at the University of Alberta is the fourth doctoral candidate that CAPI is helping fund this year, and he is investigating how climate change affects agricultural productivity across Canada, and specifically the role of government insurance programs in potentially mitigating the effects of climate change or helping farmers with mitigating those effects. Andu, unfortunately, isn't able to join us for this discussion. But leading off, we have Ehsan Pashanejad again at the UBC, talking about the work that he is doing on the prairies, looking at the impact of, or balancing, I should say, developing an index, a spatial framework for measuring agricultural productivity and conservation across the prairies. Ehsan, you are based at University of British Columbia, is that right?
Yes, thank you, Calvin. Yeah, so I'm a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia in Okanagan, and I'm doing my PhD in Earth and Environmental Sciences program. And in my PhD program, I'm focusing on developing strategies in a spatial-based system framework to optimize different objectives in a multifunctional landscape, or specifically in agricultural context in Canada, and more specifically in the Canadian prairies, where my study area is located. So, as part of my PhD program and and part of this CAPI fellowship, I am developing tools and strategies and decision-making framework to optimize and provide an effective way to manage the conflicting objectives in agricultural context.
So going back, you referred to a spatial framework across Canada's agricultural land or across the Canadian prairies. In other words, we're talking maps. Are you working with maps, Ehsan?
Yes, exactly. So my daily life is engaged with so many maps and spatial layers. So all the research I'm doing is just playing around with different layers, different maps, and to see where things are located and how we can effectively manage those things on the landscape.
All right. And again, we'll get to more. We'll dig deeper into each of your research projects here and how they all tie together under this theme of land use policy. Kwaku, why don't you fill us in on what you're studying at the University of Waterloo?
Yes, thank you so much, Kevin, for this opportunity. So, my studies in University of Waterloo, the School of Environment, Enterprise and Development, SEED, um, is into sustainability management. My background is in planning and then geoengineering. And so I'm so much passionate about the nexus between innovation and impact. And so my research essentially on a broad scale tries to look at the outcomes of innovation, particularly in agriculture, So the outcomes of agricultural innovations and how somehow it has impacted the capacities of farmers towards climate change and biodiversity loss. And so narrowing it to the perspective of CAPI, I'm trying to, first of all, tease out the part of using, similar to what Ehsan is also doing, a spatial policy framework where we could be able to assess essentially the outcome of how adoption of these digital technologies or digital innovation tools by these farmers have somehow impacted their ability or their capacity to respond towards climate change and biodiversity loss. And so I'm pretty much interested in how precision agriculture, how big data, technology and all these technologies have been able to empower these farmers or not. So I'm looking at areas where they have actually adopted these technologies, areas that have not adopted these technologies, and how through that we can be able to then show with evidence whether adopting these technologies or these innovation tools are worth investing in by these farmers or not.
Jumping in here, that was Kwaku Twum at the University of Waterloo talking about his research looking at the impact of digital agriculture tools, AI, and so on, and the relationship between that and environmental outcomes, land use change in Ontario specifically. Before that, Ehsan Pashanejad, based at the University of British Columbia, doing some similar work across the Prairies, talking about his work with maps. Rounding out our panel for this episode, the next generation is Deslaine Sosu. Deslaine, based at Laval University.
I'm Deslaine Sosu. I'm in PhD program at University Laval in the Department of Agriculture and Economics, and my research focuses on agro-environmental approaches for sustainable land use and soil conservation. And this subject are linked with the objective of CAPI Fellowship Program. My research proposal for the CAPI Fellowship is assessing the economic impact of soil conservation practices adoption on land productivity.
Going back to Ehsan and Deslaine, you may want to think about your answer for this question as well, but when you're developing an index that maps essentially agricultural conservation and productivity across the prairies, in your example, Ehsan, how do you come up with the inputs for that? How do you measure and weight the different variables when you're coming up with an index trying to make a map for Western Canada, for example?
Yeah, there's already established models and frameworks to quantify these in terms of different objectives like biophysical assessment or economic valuation of ecosystem services. My main inputs are land cover maps and land cover data, and also other complementary data sets such as climate-related variables like temperature or precipitation that we have in the landscape. And then using these with some expert opinion, literature extraction, like evaluation and quantification, we put different values for each pixels in those land cover maps. And for example, like natural habitats like grasslands are a good candidate for pollinator habitats. So they have high quality or high capacity of supplying pollination to adjacent landscape to the cropland. So this is kind of the logic that gives us an idea how I quantify those services and metrics in the landscape. And then, using advanced optimization tools to try to gauge these conflicting objectives on the landscape scale.
Okay. So, Deslaine, when you are looking at measuring the economic impact of soil conservation practices, how do you measure that in terms of coming up with a model to calculate that, put a number on that, I should say?
Yeah, so,
To measure,
oh,
uh,
Sorry, I was going to
sorry.
go to just lane for this one, Ehsan.
Sorry.
okay, to measure the economic impact, I will do it in three parts. The first part will examine the factor that condition adoption of soil conservation practices in various provinces of Canada. In terms of conservation practices, we have cover crops, we have irrigation, we have also the minimum tillage to improve soil health. So I will use farm characteristic, soil plot characteristic also, and the management they use on the farm to determine which factor impact the farmer adoption of these practices. And at the second step, I will try to know whether if they adopt these conservation practices, it affected the decision of crop selection, because the hypothesis is that farmers jointly choose soil conservation practices, plot size, and crops that maximize their net return. And one argument for that is that farmers adopt multiple practices due to their complementarities benefits for soil health and benefits. And other point is that the choice of crops to cultivate depend on the agricultural technology used. It is the directional relationship between conservation practices and crop selection. And after that, I will try to examine whether the choice of conservation practices and crop selection will affect total factor productivity. And in terms of total factor productivity, we have land productivity and labor productivity, also capital productivity on overall vegetable farms of the producers.
Mhm.
And the main result from this study will identify the more effective and region-specific conservation practices that both improve environmental and economic outcomes. Because sometimes the conservation practices that bring good benefits in Quebec, for example, it will not be the same in Ontario. And the main implication for this result is that it will reform strategic policies to promote adoption of conservation practices. And we in region where there is a substantial cost benefit advantages. The fact is that some regions, the adoption of these practices are not profitable. All farmers do not adopt these practices because the level of adoption is low. So when government implements subsidized incentive to increase adoption, farmers do not adopt it at all. So it is good to know where to implement incentive programs and where it will be profitable for farmers.
One common refrain that over the years we've often heard when talking about environmental issues and policies in agriculture is that we need better data, especially at the farm level, at the grassroots level, when it comes to all the variability across Canada, different geography, different geology, different weather patterns, so many different variables and differences as you move across the country that it's impossible to build high resolution models. And So I posed that question to our doctoral candidates here on the Ag Policy Connection, starting with Kwaku and his research at the University of Waterloo. The question being, do we need higher resolution, better data in a lot of these cases?
Yeah, I think that is actually true, and you actually hit the nail right on the spot. In my perspective, I mean, if you look at the region of Ontario, for example, the province of Ontario, which is where my research studies going to focus on, statistically, about 78% farmers are digitally, are adopting digital agriculture, for example, adopting digital technology. Even with that, it is especially on just precision farming tools, because that somehow gives them their ROI or their benefits on these tools are immediate, right? And so most of these farmers, and in this context, let me qualify it to be small farmers, are not willing to invest more into, these technologies because they can't sometimes see the long-term benefits of these investments. And so on the regional and then the provincial scale, there are data that Statistical Canada and then other, agencies have collected. But then going in detail to understand and assess the willingness parting, to understand how the yield and then the capacities of these farmers, like this, the landscape of this at the grassroots level is somehow difficult, and there's little to none in terms of data availability to support that argument. And so it is quite important that even in this research, we are trying to appreciate and understand how we could translate research at the policy level, and also collect data at the very, very, detailed level at going that scale, and trying to understand from the farmer's perspective how, their landscape look like in terms of availability of data, in terms of their approaches, in terms of outcomes of they utilizing some of these adoption, technologies, or they adopted to technologies. As uh, Ghislaine mentioned, even if you look at the idea of how farmers are incentivized when it comes to adopting certain level of technologies and certain level of farming practices. Most of the time, these incentives are normally generalized, right? Where they are not able to even tailor it to each unique farmer context. And so I feel this research makes it really, really interesting to appreciate the various layers of changes and the various layers of diversity that exists between, these farmer groups and all that. And that can literally empower and help us to, first of all, get accurate data, and secondly, understand and appreciate the various diverse groups and various changes that exist within these farm areas. And then finally, it can also help these municipalities and regions and at scale to rather offer tailored strategies and tailored policies to support farmers as we try to manage this dual problem of productivity and climate resilience.
Ehsan, is it a similar scenario in Western Canada when you're working with data where we need more of that high resolution data to improve these models?
Well, of course, we need more data, but I think this is, well, I can answer from a different perspective. So it's also more like scale dependent, like where and what scale you're working, and what kind of information and data you need to do that work. So from my perspective and the scale that I'm working at, landscape scale in the Canadian prairies, and I believe that we already have a lot of good data resources that we can make use of. And just echoing Kwaki's points, so what we need here is to translating our research and findings to more actionable insights to feed into the policy area and framework, and also on the ground for farmers. Um, I can also bring a little bit of my motivation doing my research here that gives a little bit of context. Which is more about like the policy gap, which I'm really excited about this program and also my research with CAPIs. There's urgent call from like global biodiversity and national biodiversity framework in Canada to preserve our natural resources and conservation activities by 30 by 30, what they call it. We need to preserve 30% of those natural resources and also terrestrial and also sea ecosystems and marine ecosystems by 2030. But what I am seeing in local policies is a little bit like divergence from these, and in specifically, for example, in Canada, in Canadian prairies and Saskatchewan, uh, the uh, the Saskatchewan growth plan, I think, is the same timeline for 2030 is more on economic profit of the landscape and increasing crop yields, developing irrigations, and these kind of activities. So what I see here is as the policy gap from national and global agenda to local commitments to preserving natural assets and conservation activities. So what I think is important here is using those available data already we have to fill these policy gap and to provide more convergence between these scales.
As you can hear from each of our panelists on this episode, they are passionate about the work they're doing on this topic of land use policy, the future of farmland that we've been exploring on this season of the Ag Policy Connection. And so before we wrapped up, I asked each of them one specific question, that being, what motivates them on in terms of trying to drive policy forward, come up with better policy in this area of land use?
My main motivation about this research is that it is real what is happening: soil erosion, land degradation, and it affects all agricultural channel and also consumers on the market. Because if the soil health is impacted negatively, it will affect also what we consumed. That is what motivates me first. And second, the second point is that my research is focused on vegetable crops. And vegetable crop is important food for our health. So, many studies found that the production of vegetable crops affect negatively the soil health because it consumes a lot in terms of nutrients. And if producers do not know what to do to preserve soil health, I think in many years later, yes, we will have many production in the market, but the soil health is impacted and our health in terms of human is also affected. So it is two impacts that we have to take important in our real life in terms of consumers and also producers and policies.
Great answer, Deslane. That, yes, very important. Vegetables as food, certainly, and soil health, and like you said, sometimes those two, there's a trade-off that happens, and if we could address that would be really beneficial for society. Kwaku, what do you see as your motivation getting you inspired to advance your work, your research when it comes to land use?
Yeah, so I think for me, I would say that we are actually moving into we're already there in an AI tech, driven economy where there are lots of superpowers fighting for, dominance when it comes to technology. But then within the agriculture space, I think it has been so much dormant in terms of adopting and then being more empowered from the technology point of view and see how they could drive, that industry also could be driven, be more data driven and more technology conscious. Now, tackling this to land use, I mean, there are so many realistic challenges that exist within the agriculture landscape, even here in Canada. And I must say that this is actually a problem across the globe when it comes to converting land uses from agricultural land use to either commercial or residential land uses. It's kind of everyone because of, the drive of urbanization and all that. But then one key thing that sometimes we forget is how we can equally make agriculture also very much worth investing in that can be at par, if possible, even go beyond value to also be more economically viable for people to even invest in. And there are countries that have actually adopted this across that I think Canada can actually take it up also as an opportunity. And so what excites me in my research is how I could really understand the propensity of farmers to, adopt these kind of technologies and where there could be support and where there could be, learnings from these farmers and how it can be integrated to the whole innovation design moving forward so that there could be a dual level of, technology advancement where when we are applying innovation and technology in agriculture, it doesn't only look at the generic traditional way of, prototyping products from the lab, but then it becoming more holistic and more responsible where other layers of farmer willingness of climate change, biodiversity, social outcomes, all these things can be ingrained in technology design and innovation design moving forward. And I think that could be a very competitive leverage point for Canada's agriculture landscape that can empower, for us to be more, competitive in the global market. Canada stands seventh when it comes to global food supply. And I feel it is possible that if we are able to, understand the various levels of, investing technology and investing innovation across these farmer groups and across, the various units and scopes and context of, the farmer dynamics of the land use and agriculture dynamics, it could be worth, worth supporting the Canadian agri economy to be more competitive. So that really, really excites me to see that even together with Ehsan and Islen and Andu, we are all combining our energies essentially to see how we could bring the Canadian land use and agriculture to a forefront that can, help both in policy and in the practical terms, various stakeholders that they can also get their own share to see how they can learn from all this and then make practical decisions towards development of Canada.
All right, thank you, Kwaku. That is certainly. I appreciate your optimism. That is a fascinating perspective, and I hope that it's certainly, I think, something that we should aspire to and continue working towards. So I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out of your research. Ehsan, I'll leave the final word to you in terms of we talked already about biodiversity and bringing together the policy goals there with what's happening on the ground in the prairies. What do you see as getting you excited about this research and how it could be implemented in the real world, the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so I think I've already mentioned, but what I'm trying to do with my research, and this is also my philosophy in my doctorate program and my like all the work that I'm doing is like to be more practical and pragmatic to rather than to being more like pure academic research and just like bringing something new. So I think, and I believe we already have like lots of like tools and models and data and how to really effectively translate. And now, as Kwaki mentioned, we are already there. So in Canadian prairies, we've lost more than 70% of natural grasslands. We've drained more than 40% of wetlands that they have a huge functionality in bringing so many ecosystem services and benefits to people. So what I am really trying is to bring into the table is to be more effective and also to foster transformational approaches in policy making and make a bridge between like the different skills of policy gaps. So yeah, and I'm really excited about these opportunities, and I think this is one of really great like platforms that CAPI provided at us, and each of these research are a piece of puzzles that they really need to be complement to each other and to give something hopefully new and effective in a better and sustainable landscape management approach.
We talked about it earlier in this season of the Ag Policy Connection podcast about how these conversations about land, especially when it's land that we have a personal connection to, there's not only an economic aspect to it, there's also usually some politics and almost always an emotional part to it as well. And so if you have feelings, thoughts about something that we talked about today, my email address, kheppner@realagriculture.com. Thanks again to Bronwyn Wilton, Chad Lawley, and Michael Champion for joining us here on the Ag Policy Connection as we discussed who gets to decide how land is used and how those decisions should be made, what's driving decisions and policy around land use across Canada today, and maybe what it should look like in the future. That point at the end about Indigenous voices being heard, that's something that I'll admit we should have talked about earlier in the episode. So again, if you have thoughts, my email address, kheppner@realagriculture.com. Looking forward to our sixth and final episode. Hard to believe we have already done 5 in the series here. And our sixth and final episode of this season of the Ag Policy Connection podcast, exploring the future of farmland and land use policy, featuring the next generation doctoral candidates from or fellowship recipients from across Canada working together with CAPI on research related to land use policy and how some of these things that we talked about can be moved forward. We're going to hear from several doctoral candidates from across Canada working at universities across the country as part of episode 6. We're calling it The Next Generation. So stay tuned for more here on the Ag Policy Connection, brought to you by Real Agriculture and the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. I'm Kelvin Heppner. Until next time, take care.